I'll start by saying that I think that T would have been the better 2-AR choice by a lot. And I think that the 1AR has serious undercoverage issues on T. And I think that, it starts sort of in the 2AC where there's no counter interpretation. It's sort of just a we meet argument. And, well, you do have a counter interpretation, but then you really don't spend a lot of time interacting that. And then when the 1AR doesn't extend the counter interpretation, and it's just a we meet strategy, and there's a lot of stuff that's coming from them that explains how a restriction has to be a prohibition and not just sort of a shifting of power, and then you're just like over limiting, and there's almost no analysis, and you spend like the vast majority of the 2NC going for that, so it's pretty, I think you're ahead by a lot there, and I think that's very easy.
I didn't think it was ahead because of how their block was set up in the 2AC.
Yeah, but you spend a lot of time answering that block, and then the 1AR doesn't really extend much of that block.
I just have not had a
Good experience. Okay.
I'm just like,
This is the third time I've said someone should have gone for T that they didn't go for. So you're not alone this weekend in this comment. After that, I think that I end up voting affirmative, and I think it's for the exact reason that's sort of at the top of the 2AR, which is that there is no real impact analysis that comes out. Like, I actually had written the same quote that he quotes back to me, that when you get to politics, the impacts are literally all wars and all impacts imaginable, and it's like, really, you got to at least warrant that out, right? And there's a bunch of like explanation of that that's sort of like within the 1NR on the politics law, but just not in the 2NR. And so that's what you really need to lead with is politics, impact outweighs the case, very, very clearly. And the reason why it comes down to an impact debate for me is that I don't think the counterplan solves the case, because the argument that's consistently not being answered is that if it's the executive that does it, all that you allow is the executive to have more power, which means that the executive branch is going to be able to have all the violence that's described at the top of the 2AC, the 1AR, the 2AR. Each speech is these impacts about the way that allows them to be able to have a state of exception where anyone can suddenly become an enemy and they can do whatever they want. The president can do whatever they want in order to destroy those populations. And your counterplan is, let's give the executive more power, and your answer to the permutation is the permutation would undermine executive power. Your net benefit is presidential power is good. And so I think that you need a bigger defense going for this counterplan. Presidential power is good, right? And then your counterplan essentially is an impact turn to their aft. You could solve for the OCOs, but the real impact isn't really OCO. The real impact is presidential powers creates a warmongering effect, and now we can have a pres power is good, bad debate, and you can solve whatever minor OCO impacts they have, but the impacts are being emphasized in 2AC, 1AR, 2AR are all based upon just sort of the way the presidential powers operate. So if you don't get at that, which I don't think the executive order does, then you don't capture solvency, so that way if the case outweighs the disad, then that's sort of how it ends up going down. I think that while I don't necessarily give 100% risk of solvency, I do think that I give at least a minor risk of solvency, or I would say even a substantial risk. And I think that you should do more in terms of the way that the president is going. Like, when the president goes behind the scenes, it is not just that they go behind the scenes, but what you were doing sort of in the 2NC is that this going behind the scenes then means that Obama's going to use worse means than just OCO. So it's not a no solvency argument. It's a piece of offense, because if Obama can't use offensive cyber operations to do something, then he will resort to, technical nuclear weapons, drone strikes, whatever else, something along those lines. So that way, if they get their durable fiat, he has to comply with not to do OCO. Well, he's going to do something else that's going to do all those bad things that you're talking about at the top of the debate, right? And that becomes then a offensive articulation of it that becomes easier for me to be like, I don't care about this durable if fiat resolves or doesn't resolve the issue. It becomes something that is something that will stop or will make the situation worse. And I think that would be a better phrasing of it, where I could then go to that. But I think that essentially the thesis of the disclosure is that the impact analysis on either the case debate or the politics would be what I need in order to be able to set up a paradigm where I think that it's possible for me to be able to vote neg. Once I have, if you did impact analysis, I think that they're also sort of behind on the politics debate, both because the 2AC doesn't have any of the arguments. Right? In the cross-examination, the 1NC you point out is not on the docket. And you're like, I found a card on Google. I can cut it if you want me to. But you don't ever actually cut it. Like, use that 2AC prep time, give him the card that you found, So that way you have a card saying not on the docket. Right now, instead, we have analytical assertion of no time frame, and they have like 3-4 pieces of evidence that says it's coming up, he's pushing on it. So obviously I'm going to end up having to listen to that versus this, right? Versus your cross-ex, I found something on the internet, right? Take the next two steps, because even if they don't want to see it, and they don't want to see it because they think you're wrong, I want to see it. And that's really who you want to get to see it. And so the 2AC sort of, in my mind, has to have better answers to politics outside of the judicial branch doesn't gain access to it, because you give the authority to Congress. It means any time the OCO comes up, Congress has to engage in these questions, which means every single time, again and again, Obama needs to fight. Their argument is that Obama will constantly fight Congress if it's within Congress's authority. So it's not that the judicial branch shields, like in other topics where the judicial branch passes something and then Obama doesn't get credit. Here, there is going to be the active fight. And I think that is what the two of you do well, is sort of explaining how the link still operates in the world of the judicial branch. It's through the enforcement of it that is going to get caught up, not in the initial passage of plan. And I think that that's something that's never, you don't ever really come to grips with, which means that I think there is a very clear link, and given that there's no card that is mentioned in the cross-examination, there's also a uniqueness story. So then it's just a question of the impact story, and without impacts, it's sort of like an FYI of like, here you go, right? And so it's like, and I think that, I don't know, maybe he's had me before enough to be like that. I like to have sort of impacts for grounded, right? Because he's like, I'll do the impact at the front. Here's the impacts that he didn't do, and then that's immediately after his impact analysis, right? I think that, if you have me in the future, prioritizing the impact is really important in relation to policy debates in terms of magnitude, probability, and time frame. And so if you're going to do policy type debating, you need to sort of convince me that your impact is going to be greater than theirs. So in this case, that would be what I would go to first in the 2 hour is your offense, the disad, then your counterplan, which captures as much offense as you can from the affirmative, and then your case debate, especially if your case debate is going to be mostly defense, right? You spend a large time going for can't solve, and that time would have been much better spent on they're bad, they lose, impact, right? And so I think that time adjustment would make a big difference. Yeah.
How could I impact it? Because what were the defending like political warfare and work on defending, turn all the things on politics and then the kind of global warfare stuff on case? How would I compare the analysis?
First, I would go to the piece of evidence that's being read. Because in that piece of evidence, it'll say how it causes every impact imaginable, right? Because you have a tagline that says that. Within the card, it doesn't say every impact imaginable. It lists a couple of things with a couple of warrants in there, right? So then explaining that then gives me a story for how I know it causes these impacts. And then you could compare that to the time frame of theirs, right? There's a systemic impact that's sort of ongoing, which means we know what that impact looks like now. Yours is an apocalyptic event that could happen overnight, that could just kill everything because of insert specific scenario, right? And so that becomes a much different thing, and you could be like, the time frame to extinction with us is the vote's coming up in a month or whatever is coming up. Here's that time frame. So now time frame, and since the magnitude of both, essentially it could be extinction, time frame becomes more important, and then you add in probability. There's 100% probability because they have not disputed our uniqueness or our link claims, and we will minimize their probability when we get to the solvency debate. So that way my disclosure goes, I think that the AF might have a chance to solve, but might not, which is in my disclosure anyhow. But that decrease in probability means that the impacts of the disad outweigh even if the magnitude is larger on the affirmative. So even if they have magnitude, if you have time frame and probability, you can win that debate. And if the card is saying what it's tagged to say, then your magnitude is going to be equally as large. Right, and so those would be the things that I would do, and if you structure the 2 hour around that, that would make for a much better 2 hour. I would also really have analysis. I would do something along the lines of, because that I have the ability as the judge to vote for the status quo or the counter plan in your 2 R, right? Because something that I have going into the decision that was in the back of my head was, if the counter plan upholds presidential presidential powers, you're going to trigger with that counter. If I vote neg and I vote for the counter plan, you will trigger the impacts of the affirmative regardless. And if those impacts outweigh, then that makes it more than disad. But if I could revert to the status quo, then presidential powers don't necessarily have to be happened when I vote negative. I could vote for the status quo and then the disad, right? And so that way, even if their impacts are large, because they're systemic impacts, they're not going to be made worse, like would happen in the case of the counterplan. And so giving me that status quo option then gives me two ways for me to be able to evaluate the disad. So if I determine that counterplan can't solve and can only make things worse because of increasing presidential powers, I could be like, well, let me evaluate now the disad versus the status quo. I would still think I'd vote F in this round because of the impact analysis, but that gives me another out for you, even if I think that they're winning sort of the, impact turn to the counterplan that you increase presidential powers. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, and I think that in terms of like answering some of these arguments, I would try and stick them with the counterplan a lot more than you do. Like I would have a bigger debate on the fact that it is presidential powers. Like, because while it's in every single speech, it is not the central focus of every speech. Your central focus is more on the permutation in every speech, especially in the 1AR. And I think that the permutation doesn't make as much sense because the permutation definitely links to politics, and they're definitely reading cards that says that the president will have their power undermined by doing this, which means that the real argument that you need to win regardless is that presidential power is bad, and that's just the impact turn to the counterplan, and then you could read cards that say executive orders increase presidential powers. You can also read a bunch of cards if you're interested for politics that executive orders link to politics. So evidence exists, a dime a dozen in any politics back file, because P doesn't answer to XO counterplan. So you could be able to do that to make it also harder for them, so that way they don't get a clear net benefit to the counterplan as well.
Do you think the double bind, I don't think it came out really very strongly until the 2AR, but do you think the double bind set up with the cross application of over 11?
Yeah, no, I think it's clear. I think it's clear in the 1AR also there, and I think it's a pretty good argument. Is like either it's going to increase the presidential war powers, and that will be problematic, or that it won't get in the way, and then we'll be able to solve with the permutation. So, like, sort of, I get what's going on with that permutation, but to me, setting up that argument is less important than just being like counterplan bad, right? If counterplan is bad, you're also doing your impact work and explaining why the plan is good at that moment. And so doing a permutation that tries to do the counterplan, like it gives them something extra to do, so having it in the 2AC maybe not a bad idea, but like that's where the majority of the time is spent on the counterplan flow by the negative, is that's one of the easy ones that you could drop out of in the 1IR, go to pres power is bad, and then read another card impacting pres power is bad, and that could be, and then that puts a lot of pressure then in the 2NR because you've collapsed only down to your offense. And I would probably figure out if the counterplan, what's the status of the counterplan, and figure out can you get away with just impact turning and sticking them with it with no permutation. Like if it's dispo, you kick the perm, you go for offense. Then if you win that pres powers are bad, the disad becomes irrelevant and it could be a straight out ways. Right? So it's like, knowing the status of the counterplan allows that execution of the 1AR to be cleaner if you can get away with sticking them to it, or versus just them being able to kick out of that. But even if they kick out of that, if your impact turn is presidential power is good, you're still solving that with your F, so it's still a valuable time spent in the 1IR is going for that argument and making those impacts bigger in relation to things. I would say that the serial policy failure argument could be clearer on the politics disad, right? That means that infighting, and he's going to fight over every sorts of different things in serial politics, will mean that the impacts of politics is inevitable, because even if this plan, doesn't stop it because this isn't happening, it doesn't mean there's not a million other things that he's going to constantly fight on, and that's going to make it so that way it fails. And yes, I hear that argument in your speeches, but again, it's one of the things that could be done better in each of the speeches. Yep. Anything else?
Anyone in our tips?
I think you did a good job on politics. I mean, it was just sort of a straight politics debate. I think that you could have been a little bit like, okay, so they have no evidence outside of something that they reference in cross-examination. It means you do not give them any leeway, even if you think our evidence is not phenomenal. Our evidence is the only evidence in the round, and here are additional cards in that relation to things. I would also probably try and do some of the work that I'm suggesting the 2-1R do in terms of impact analysis. Like, you do a good job explaining your impacts, but you could do that explanation of impacts in relation to the affirmative impacts, time frame, magnitude, probability, and pull their card that is their impact card and look at it. And there's a great space part to be like, their impact card doesn't actually say it's going to cause the end of the world and all blah, 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 blah. It's power tagged. It's some critical theorist who's just, using some big terms to explain why things are getting bad, and then be like, our evidence actually says nuclear war. Our evidence actually says that this will cause extinction, and our evidence creates a time frame that happens within the next month, right? And so that's the comparative work. And if you do that in the 1NR, there's more leeway for the 2NR, because then he could just reference that back opposed to just like a tag, right? And I think you go more than a tag on yours, but you don't do the comparative stuff that makes it even easier for the 2NR. And also, in any sort of sense, if you know that's the direction you want to go, that's a great place to start decreasing the how good their evidence is on the impact level, right? Your partner in the 2NC takes the case debate and decreases the probability of solving. Now you in the 1NR mitigate that impact, so that way it becomes so small that even if you lose the solvency question, it doesn't matter because they solve for something that is so minute, and that debate is then on the politics dissent, which means that it makes it difficult for the affirmative to answer all of case, because they have to answer the impacts on the flow you want it to be on and not the flow they want it to be on, because their impacts exist on the case flow exclusively and the interactions don't take place.
Okay.
So,
Thank you. That
yep.
helps. I think I was scared with like the link story because I've lost on it before, or we've lost on it before, where it was like, we're courts don't actually have to do congressional backlash. I like wanted to make the link story.
Yeah, sometimes I can see courts avoiding it if it's like a piece of legislation that doesn't have to keep going up to Congress, right? Here it seems like it keep going to Congress, and you might be able to be like give examples of like when the authority is going to constantly have to come out, because Congress has authority in other issues, but that means it happens, right? So I think that maybe a little bit clearer on it, but I think the enforcement question was clear enough in my head.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
One question. When going to totality, what specifically, if I was to go for theoretically, what should I have typed on?
Well, I think in this way, I think talking about limits is good, because, for instance, when you don't prohibit and you just shift who has authority to restrict, it means that they could get out of any sort of disad by saying that it won't be necessarily enforced, right? Like if you read a disad that says OCO is necessary in this instance, they could read a piece of evidence or make the argument if it's really necessary, Congress would authorize it, right? Which means the power has not been restricted, which you define as prohibited, right? It's just been, bracketed or limited a little bit. And I think that, in my mind, that shift of authority is a restriction, because there's no restrictions now, there's no authority over it, but it is. But your definitions clearly say it's not, and your 2NC does a good job of being like legal language to be prioritized on a legal topic. And one of your pieces of evidence, I think it comes from something like within the military or within the Congress, maybe I'm thinking of a different realm, but I think that your legal analysis is a reason for why I should prefer yours versus there are, I think, words and phrases or something evidence. So it's like, yeah, it's like, so you have evidence that explains it in a legal terminology, which means that legal-based education in terms of the way that restrictions are actually, because your evidence definitely says this court determines that, that this language should mean this, which means that we shouldn't take a layperson's understanding of it to get the topic-specific education that we're hoping to get to when we're talking about restrictions within a legal sense, right? Versus like restricting my kid's diet is who has the authority to feed them what, which is a different conversation than restricting a legal precedent, right? And so that gives a reason for why your stuff should be, better. And their only offense for why their interpretation is better than yours is that you overlimit because you'll create 5 Fs, right? So you just have to explain how it's not overlimiting, and then go into all the stuff for why their words and phrases evidence that says it means limits isn't as good as the limits that you set up based upon prohibiting, because prohibiting is better. There's different ways to prohibit.